Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into Rogue Genesia, a game that throws you into the chaos of bullet hell, but with a twist, soul cards. These cards are the key to surviving and clearing stages, each offering powerful buffs or even unique attacks that can seriously boost your chances of making it through. But with so many to choose from, how do you know which ones are worth your time? That's where we come in. In this video, we're breaking down a complete Rogue Genesia soul cards tier list to help you pick the absolute best cards for your run. Whether you're trying to beat your high score or clear tougher stages, knowing which cards give you the best edge is crucial. So sit tight and let's get into the cards that will take your gameplay to the next level. I'm quickly moving on to the video and I'm ranking soul cards in Rogue Genesia. Before we start, if you enjoy these types of tier list videos, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Enjoy watching.
My friends, only 0.1% of viewers subscribe. If you like this type of content, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you in advance for your support.
The soul cards in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right: Spear, Absolute Focus, Heavy, Accumulation, Castle, Revolution, and Rune of Heaviness. Okay, so now let's talk about the D tier soul cards in Rogue Genesia. These are the ones that just don't quite make the cut when it comes to scaling into the later stages of the game. They have their moments, sure, but if you're looking to push through to the endgame with some serious power, you might want to think twice before picking these up. But hey, they still have their uses, so let's break them down. First up, we have the Spear. Now, this card gives you a nice close-range melee weapon with decent range, which sounds like it could be a solid choice. The problem though is that its DPS just doesn't really scale well into the late game. It starts to fall off quickly as the tougher enemies start coming at you. Plus, it doesn't lead to any viable evolutions, so it doesn't really fit into most high tier builds. It's fine for the early to mid game, but you'll likely want to swap it out once things start getting serious. Next is Absolute Focus. This one can really give your critical damage a massive boost, up to a 500% increase. That sounds pretty awesome, right? But here's the catch, it massively decreases your critical chance, sometimes by up to 50%. So, while you get these huge critical damage numbers, you'll be hitting fewer criticals overall. Plus, it's a bit tricky to unlock, which means you'll be spending a lot of effort just to get it to work. If you're not careful, this could actually end up hurting your DPS rather than helping it. Let's move on to Accumulation. This card provides decent buffs to projectile weapons, which could be a big help if that's your preferred playstyle. But here's the issue, it doesn't offer any buffs to AoE weapons or other types of builds. So if you're working with anything other than a projectile setup, this card is pretty much useless. It can also be detrimental if you're building around attack speed because it doesn't mesh well with that type of setup. Now, Castle is an interesting one. It provides a solid defense buff and is really useful in the early game, especially when you're still trying to build up your survivability. But like many early game buffs, it doesn't scale well into the later stages. Without additional defense buffs, the Castle card starts to lose its value as the game progresses, and you'll likely find yourself needing something more powerful to keep up with the tougher enemies. Still, it's not terrible early on, so it has its moments. Moving on to Heavy. This card increases your DPS significantly and gives you damage multipliers, which sounds like a dream come true, right? The downside, it heavily decreases your attack speed, making it less ideal for most top tier weapons, especially those that rely on fast, repetitive hits. If you're using a slower weapon or have a build focused on burst damage, Heavy can work, but for most setups, it just ends up slowing you down more than it helps. Then there's Revolution, which has a pretty cool gimmick. It can insta-kill almost any normal mob under 20% HP. It sounds awesome, right? The issue is that it doesn't really work unless you're using AoE weapons. If you're not, Revolution isn't going to be nearly as effective, and it starts to feel a little weak, especially against elite mobs later on. It's one of those cards that can feel powerful at first, but as the game progresses, it becomes less and less useful unless you build specifically for it. Next, we've got Rune of Heaviness. This card gives you a nice boost to DPS, knockback, and a damage multiplier for all projectiles. Sounds pretty good on paper, but here's the kicker. It's just not ideal for attack speeds, builds, or projectile heavy setups. Plus, it starts to lose its value in the late game, as the stat buffs are pretty underwhelming by that point. It's one of those cards that could work in the early to mid game, but quickly becomes obsolete when the enemies start ramping up. So, there you have it. The D tier soul cards. Soul cards are definitely interesting, and they have their uses, but they just don't scale well or provide the level of impact you'll need in the later stages of Rogue Genesia. If you find yourself with one of these cards, they might work for a little while, but eventually you'll probably want to swap them out for something with more power and scalability. That said, if you're looking for fun and experimentation, these cards can still offer some entertaining moments. The soul cards in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right: Railgun, Windblade, Thunderstaff, Bow, Vine, Concentration, Lightning Spirit, and Energizer. Alright, let's dive into the C tier soul cards in Rogue Genesia. These cards aren't necessarily bad, but they're definitely more situational and come with a few weaknesses that can hold them back in the long run. You're gonna need to use them strategically, but they can still shine in the right circumstances. Let's break down what each of these cards brings to the table, and maybe you'll find a new hidden gem for your next run. First, let's talk about the Railgun. Now, this card has some decent damage and a long range, so it's a great pick for consistent DPS early on. The problem though is that it falls off pretty hard in the late game. The high cooldown makes it tough to keep up with the increasingly stronger mobs. You'll see it do some good work in the early stages, but as the waves ramp up, the Railgun just doesn't scale well enough to keep up. Still, it's solid for that middle ground if you're looking for some reliable damage. Next up, we've got the Windblade. This one is pretty fun because it stops mobs from approaching you, no matter what kind they are. You can also scale its power with the area size, and if you upgrade it, it becomes an even stronger soul card. However, the downside here is the super slow cooldown. While it's useful for keeping mobs at bay, it tends to lose its effectiveness as the game progresses. It's a solid pick in the early game, but you might find it lacking as you move into the later stages. The Thunderstaff is another card that looks promising but has some major drawbacks. It's a single target weapon with slower attack speed, but the real strength comes when it chains attacks after hitting a mob. It's got potential in the late game, especially for chaining damage across groups of enemies, but it suffers from a lack of DPS both early and late. It really needs evolution to reach its full potential. Without it, the Thunderstaff might feel a bit underwhelming in your build. Moving on to Vine, which is similar to the Windblade in that it can stop mobs from approaching you, and it also scales with area size. It evolves into a stronger version as you progress, but like the Windblade, the cooldown is pretty slow. Again, it's a great card for the early game, but by the time you hit the later stages, it might start to feel a little bit too slow to be as effective as it could be. If you need something to slow down mobs early though, Vine can do that job fairly well. Let's talk about the Bow now. It's a decent single target, projectile-based weapon, and it offers consistent DPS. The downside, however, is that it doesn't have any AoE, so it can really struggle when dealing with groups of enemies. It's a good choice if you want steady damage, but you'll need other cards to help with crowd control. The bow also depends heavily on the number of projectiles you can fire, so its effectiveness can be limited if you're not stacking the right upgrades. Next, we have Concentration, and let me tell you, this card is perfect for boosting your damage. At max level, it increases your damage by nearly 80%, which is huge. The catch is that it decreases your range by 25%, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If you're using weapons with long range or AoE attacks, the range reduction might hurt more than it helps, but for some of those close range builds, this can be a game changer in terms of raw damage output. Just be careful about how you build around it. The Thunder Spirit is similar to the Fire Spirit, dealing chain damage to enemies. While it's nice to have that ability to hit multiple targets, the problem is that it doesn't scale well as you progress through the game. You need multiple projectiles to really make the most of it, and its DPS value stays pretty fixed, so you won't see a lot of growth from it. It's a fun card, but it doesn't quite keep up with the other damage dealers in the late game. Last but not least, we've got Energizer. This card boosts your damage substantially, much like Concentration, but it works best with AoE weapons. The problem is that it severely decreases the viability of projectile weapons, so it's a bit of a one-trick pony. If you're focusing on AoE builds, then this can really boost your power, but if you're trying to work in projectile weapons, you might want to skip it. So there you have it. The C tier soul cards. They all have their moments, but they're definitely more situational than some of the other cards. If you're playing around with different builds, these can still be fun to use, but don't expect them to carry you on their own. With the right strategy and a little bit of patience though, you might just find the perfect way to make these cards work for you. The soul cards in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right: Kunai, Shuriken, Void Wisp, Magic Wand, Ice Spirit, Recursion, Wormhole, Ice Spirit, and Lightweight. Let's dive into the B tier soul cards of Rogue Genesia. These cards are solid picks and can definitely help you out, but they do have their quirks. They might not be the flashiest, but they definitely have their time to shine if used right. So let's take a look at these cards and see what makes them tick. First up is the Shuriken. This one's an easy go-to for a lot of players because it's simple to unlock and upgrade. It's a reliable projectile weapon with good scaling, especially in the early game. You'll notice that it really shines early on, helping you clear those initial waves of enemies with ease. But as you move into the late game, the Shuriken starts to fall off a bit unless you evolve it. Without that evolution, it just can't keep up with the tougher enemies, so keep that in mind if you're relying on it for the long haul. Next is the Kunai, which brings AoE based damage into the mix. It's got decent DPS and is also pretty easy to unlock and scale. The cool thing about the Kunai is that it's great for hitting multiple enemies at once, especially in the early game. However, it's very dependent on the number of projectiles you've got going. Without some serious upgrades, it can struggle to scale up, so you'll need to make sure you're investing in those upgrades to keep it viable later on. Then we have the Magic Wand, which is all about multi-target damage. This card has good scaling, and while its DPS is low at first, it increases significantly as you stack up those projectiles. The downside is that the Magic Wand can be tough to use in the late game if you're relying on it alone. It needs a bit of support to really shine once the waves get harder, but if you've got the right setup, it can be a great asset for clearing out enemies. The Void Wisp is another card that brings the power, especially when it comes to chain DPS. It's a stronger version of the Void Wisp with high DPS and solid scaling, if you can manage its attack speed. The challenge here is that it can be tricky to use on its own in the late game, as you'll need a good attack speed to make the most of it. Without that, its potential can really drop off, so it requires some setup to get the full benefit. Let's talk about the Fire Spirit next. This one's a great modifier for wands and staffs, as it boosts their DPS significantly. The Fire Spirit scaling is decent, but it's important to note that it doesn't scale in terms of DPS. Instead, it boosts the ATK stat, so it gives a fixed boost rather than an increasing one. It's a solid choice for specific builds, but you'll need to make sure you're pairing it with the right weapons to make the most of it. Now, the Ice Spirit is all about debuffing enemies. It doesn't provide any direct DPS, but it slows enemies by almost 51%, which can be incredibly useful for controlling the battlefield. The downside, however, is that it doesn't increase your damage output at all, so you'll need to rely on your other weapons for the killing blow. If you've got a good DPS build going, the Ice Spirit can be a nice addition for crowd control. Moving on, we've got Recursion, which provides a huge power multiplier buff. This card scales really well with upgrades, especially in the late game, making it an excellent choice for those long-lasting builds. The only issue is that it mainly affects projectiles, so if you're using other types of weapons, you won't get as much value out of it. But if you're going for a projectile-heavy build, Recursion can really take your damage output to the next level. Last but not least, we've got Wormhole. This one is similar to Rift, but not quite as effective. It provides decent defense against mobs while still preserving your DPS, but it lacks the scaling you'll need in the late game. As the waves get tougher, you might find that the Wormhole doesn't quite measure up to some of the other cards that keep scaling stronger as the game progresses. It's not a bad choice, but it may need some backup to stay relevant, and there you have it. The B-tier soul cards. These cards can definitely carry you through a lot of the game, but they've got their limitations. Whether you're relying on the early game strength of the Shuriken or the chain damage of the Void Wisp, each card has its own unique role. Just remember to plan your upgrades and synergies wisely to get the most out of them. The soul cards in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right: Staff of Storms, Death Aura, Ice Nova, Multi-Handed, Bookworm, Gravity Field, Fractal, Volcanic Fury, and Rune of Alacrity. Okay, let's talk about the real heavy hitters in the world of Rogue Genesia, the A-tier soul cards. These are the cards you want to get your hands on if you're aiming to absolutely crush those mobs and dominate the late game. Whether you're looking for insane DPS or incredible scaling, these soul cards have got you covered. So, let's dive into some of the best cards you should be hunting for in your next run. First up, we've got the Staff of Storms. If you've ever used the Arcanist staff, you'll know how powerful it is. Well, the Staff of Storms takes that power to the next level by dealing more chain damage. It's got high ATK damage and a low cooldown, making it perfect for dishing out consistent DPS. What really makes this card shine though is its late game scaling. As the game goes on, the damage just keeps ramping up, and unlocking this is pretty easy, so it's definitely a card you want in your deck if you're aiming for the long haul. Next, we've got the Death Aura. Oh, trying to play. Think of it like a weaker Fire Ring, but don't let that fool you. It's got huge AoE and consistent DPS, making it a great all-around choice for clearing mobs. It's super easy to unlock and upgrade, which means you can start seeing its benefits pretty quickly. Sure, it might not hit as hard as the Fire Ring, but it's definitely a great choice if you need something reliable and capable of wiping out large groups of enemies. Let's talk about Ice Nova now. This one starts off slow, but once it gets going, it packs a punch with one of the highest 80k damage outputs in the game. The scaling on this card is insane, especially if you pair it with modifiers that boost projectile damage. It's easy to unlock and pairs perfectly with other projectile weapons, making it a great pick for those looking to build a powerful late game setup. If you're in it for the long run, Ice Nova will definitely serve you well. Now, the multi-handed upgrade is a game changer for any projectile weapon build. This card doubles or even triples your DPS with no downside. That's right, more damage, no strings attached. It's a must-have for anyone focusing on projectile-based weapons and is relatively easy to unlock and max out. If you want to see your DPS skyrocket, this is the card that will get you there. Plus, it's always nice when something is both powerful and straightforward to get. Moving on to the Gravity Field, and oh boy, this one is wild for AoE builds. It slows down mobs tremendously as they approach, giving you more time to react and more opportunities to lay down some serious damage. And if you like to stack slows, the Gravity Field will be your best friend. The scaling on this one is great, and with a nearly 90% slow debuff, your enemies will hardly stand a chance. If you're building around crowd control, this card is definitely a must-have. Next, we've got Bookworm. If you're planning for the long haul, this is an essential card. It boosts your EXP gain significantly, which means you can level up faster and get stronger throughout the game. It's easy to upgrade, and it can even be ascended into higher base EXP gain, making it an investment that pays off big time as you go further into the game. If you're all about scaling up and outlasting your enemies, you'll definitely want this in your deck. Then there's Fractal, another card that's essential for projectile-based builds. It's similar to the multi-handed card. The soul cards in this tier are, in order from top left to bottom right, Arcanist's Staff, Fuma Shuriken, Katana, Fire Ring, Rift, and Rune of Luck. Let's dive into the big leagues. If you're serious about dominating your runs in Rogue Genesia, you'll want to know about the S-tier soul cards. These are the heavy hitters, the cards that can absolutely change the tide of the game and make you feel like a total powerhouse. Whether you're melting through enemies or unlocking insane evolutions, these cards will take you to the next level. Let's break down what makes them so awesome. First, let's talk about Arcanist's Staff. This one is all about the high DPS. It's a long-range projectile weapon that's perfect for dealing out massive single-target damage with a crazy attack speed. What makes it even better is how easy it is to unlock its evolution, which gives it fantastic scaling in the late game. If you're looking to carry the team with damage, this staff is the way to go. It's got the kind of power you can rely on as the enemies start getting tougher. Right alongside it is the Fuma Shuriken, which is basically the ninja's dream weapon. It's another high DPS, long-range projectile weapon that dishes out massive damage to single targets. And just like the Arcanist's Staff, the Fuma Shuriken scales beautifully with attack speed and is a breeze to evolve. If you love the idea of throwing shurikens at your enemies while racking up a ridiculous amount of damage, then this card will definitely be your go-to. Plus, the fact that it's so easy to unlock its evolution means you're going to feel powerful pretty quickly. Then we have the Fire Ring, which brings the heat in a whole different way. This card has an insane AoE, area of effect, with massive base damage, making it perfect for clearing out hordes of enemies. Sure, it has a slow cooldown, but once you start stacking attack speed, it becomes a late game monster. The Fire Ring can carry you through the early game with ease, and when you scale it properly, it'll be burning everything in sight. If you're someone who loves watching everything around you get annihilated, this card is for you. Next, we've got the Katana, and this one is a bit of a game changer. It's one of the best AoE single target weapons in the game, capable of hitting multiple hits on a single target simultaneously. That means you can take down even the toughest enemies in just a few swipes. And just like the others, the Katana scales incredibly well with attack speed and damage multipliers. So if you're looking for a weapon that keeps getting better the longer you use it, this is your best bet. Plus, the satisfaction of slicing through mobs in a flurry of deadly strikes? Priceless. Let's get a little spicy with the Rift, which is just an absolute beast in mid to late game. This card is all about synergy, as it teleports any mob that gets hit by you. It's extremely overpowered when paired with AoE weapons like the Fire Ring because you can hit multiple enemies, and the Rift will just keep teleporting them around, making it even easier to manage those large waves. This is one of those cards that can really change the way you think about the game and make you feel like you're controlling the battlefield. Of course, we can't forget about Rune of Luck. If you love stacking critical hits, who doesn't? This is the card for you. It increases your critical chance by 40%, which is a huge DPS boost and pretty much guarantees a critical hit with every attack. The Rune of Luck is one of the most overpowered weapon modifiers, making it a must-have if you're aiming for those massive damage numbers. You'll be critting left and right, and it's honestly pretty satisfying to see all those numbers explode on the screen. The beauty of these S tier cards is how they can completely shape your strategy. Whether you're focusing on AoE destruction, insane single target damage, or crits that will melt everything in sight, these cards offer so much versatility and power. They're easy to unlock and scale well into the late game, making them perfect for any player looking to push their runs to the next level. So if you've got the chance to pick up any of these cards, do it. You won't regret it. The video ends here. See you in another video. Don't forget to subscribe.